Hosea chapter 1, though. So last week, we spent a fair amount of time. Oh, hold on, let me take out my clock here, since I forgot to replace the batteries in that one. So apparently we are all about 4 hours late for class. But Hosea chapter 1, we started last week reading through it and considering the idea of the marriage relationship, how God has always looked at his people as their bride, whether it was in the Old Testament and looking at Israel specifically, or those who were, for lack of a better phrase, grafted in, those proselytes, those Gentiles who converted to Judaism. And then in the New Testament, the bride of Christ would be his church, right? And Paul uses it extensively in his letters. John uses it as well. So that's really what we're looking at here. And again, some people do not believe that what he has told Hosea to do, which was to marry a woman of harlotry, Gomer, that it actually happened, that it's more of a parable, if you will, between his people. Others, I tend to agree with this, is that it did actually happen. We can look at some historical documents to show them dealing with the Assyrians and Egyptians and what have you regarding that. So we looked at last week, we got up to verse 4. We are going to try to go through it faster, I promise. But it is important to understand, because in this idea of a marriage relationship, it speaks very much about our own relationship with God, especially in chapter 2 when we get a little bit further along. But the Lord came to Hosea, and it says that the first time he talked to him, the first thing that he did was to marry a woman of harlotry, a woman of promiscuity. Now, there is, some translations will say an adulteress. Some commentators will even say that she is an adulteress at this time. There's a little bit of division on that because of what she says again in chapter 2 in verse 7, when she says, I will return back to my first husband. And that first husband is to be God, and we'll get into that a little bit. But also that if she was an adulteress, then Old Testament law, her and the man that she would have been with, or the woman, because that occurred as well, is that they both would have been put to death at that time. It wasn't necessarily mandatory that it be carried out, but it could be carried out. So I tend to believe that she was a promiscuous woman, but she was not necessarily an adulterous woman. Also, because of and I realize that it's technically the New Testament because we find it in the gospel accounts, but it's still under Old Testament law, that Jesus said anyone who takes an adulterer for marriage, they themselves become an adulterer, right? Now, if we're looking at this in the idea that Hosea is representing God and Gomer is representing God's people, and we put it in light of that because that is exactly what's happening, then essentially God would be saying that he too is an adulterer because he took an adulterous wife. Does that make sense? That according to what Jesus says in the New Testament, if you marry someone who is guilty of adultery, you become an adulterer. So if we look in the Old Testament, and if we have that Gomer, or that God is telling Hosea, who represents him, to marry someone who has committed adultery, that would make Hosea an adulterer. And Hosea representing God. I'm not saying that God is an adulterer, I'm just saying the symbolism there. Does that make sense? So we left off, and we were talking about the kids. We have no idea how many kids actually had. They were told to have children, and It's the idea there of have children of harlotry. Now, we don't know if that Gomer had children prior to marrying Hosea, or if the idea, again, is that they will follow in the footsteps of their mother. Most tend to believe that it was that they would follow after her ways. An easy way to understand it is when we're raising children, right? Well, sorry, you raise cattle, you rear children. When we're rearing children, right? Come on, I know you've heard that. That's how I remember the difference. You raise cattle, you rear children. But when rearing children, they go based off of, a lot of the times, what their parents do. If you have children, if you are a faithful Christian and you're going to worship services, well, then the chances are high that your children will grow up and become Christians and attend services and what have you. Not saying it's a guarantee, but there's a higher likelihood of it. It's the same idea here, in that they're thinking that because of this is the way that Gomer was, Gomer representing God's people, that her children, the descendants, would follow after that same path of being unfaithful to God. Make sense? So any questions over last week or what I've just said, or do I need to clear anything up? Okay. If just yell out if you do. Well, maybe not yell out. That would negate the whole decency and good order thing. But so verse 4, we'll just go back to verse 3. So he went into Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. Then verse 4. And the Lord said to him, name him Jezreel for yet a little while, and I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. Verse 5, on that day I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. We'll just go ahead and read through verse 9. Then she conceived again and gave birth to a daughter, and the Lord said to him, name her Lo-Ruhamah, for I will no longer have compassion on the house of Israel, that I would even ever forgive them. But I will have compassion on the house of Judah, and deliver them by the Lord their God, and will not deliver them by bow, sword, battle, horses, or horsemen. When she had weaned Lo-Ruhamah, we'll go with that, she conceived and gave birth to a son. And the Lord said, name him Lo-Ammi, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. Now again, we don't know how many children Hosea had in total, but there is the thought that 2 of the 3 mentioned here were from adultery that would be committed. Not before they got married, but after. There's just a thought, but there's not necessarily any evidence to it. Notice how in verse 3, though, it says that she bore him a son, right? So it says, in verse 3, so he went to Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and conceived and bore him a son. But then when you get down to verses 6 and 8, it says she gave birth to a daughter. And then verse 8, she conceived and gave birth to a son. So there's some idea there that one of them was theirs, because it says, just because of the language, that she bore him a son. And then the other 2 ones that are mentioned, she just gave birth. It wasn't that she bore a son to Hosea, right? So that somewhere in there was the adultery. That's why the question of her adultery is so confusing. Because it's, did she start immediately, what was the time period and what have you. But even still, even though it would have been, we'll just say that it was the children of some other people, some other guy. Well, even still, it was customary practice among the Hebrews to give their children's names that had special meanings. If we go back and look at the genealogy, and I don't remember the actual phrase offhand, but in chapter 5 of Genesis, I think I did a lesson or a devotional on this, but if you just look at the meanings behind their names, it actually kind of spells out a sentence that God will come and heal his people. I can get that for you later if anybody's interested. But their names had special meanings. A name could express an affirmation or a faith in God, could signify parental hope for their child. It could have been the trait of a baby. Sometimes a child was not named right away. I know that in some caste systems within India, that they wait until the grandmother has actually chosen a name. And sometimes that might be 2 or 3 years down the line. It depends on when it kind of strikes her. Not in all India, just certain caste systems. And in Hosea, his family, each name is given by the Lord to bear a divine message for the people. There was a royal city by his name at the tip, the western tip of Mount Gilboa, and also a valley that lay to its west. Its soil, it was always highly productive. Jehu was an army general, and he attacked the royal city soon after Ahab killed Jezebel with her various pagan prophets. If you remember that. Jehu became king and continued to brutally destroy anyone that he didn't like. Anybody that questioned his reign, anybody that got in the way. And the boy's name there, the boy's name, it symbolizes God's punishment for the sin, and it's going to happen at the same place. If you're taking notes, 2 Kings chapter 9, verses 21 through 28. Also in 2 Kings chapter 9, there's verses 30 through 37. And chapter 10 of 2 Kings, verses 1 through 10. So the name again is of the child is representing God's punishment. Did you get all those references? Don't you do? So 2 Kings 9, 21 to 28, 2 Kings 9, 30 to 37, and 2 Kings 10, 1 through 10. But his name represents the punishment that God is going to inflict on the people for their sin, and it's going to happen at the same place. The fulfillment of this Jezreel judgment, it came in due season. Note the words there in verse 4, where it says, "For yet a little while." Now, let me see here. We go back to Psalms. Okay, Psalm 37 and verse 10, the same language is used. Psalm 37 and verse 10 reads, "Yet a little while, and the wicked man will be no more, and you will look carefully for his place, and he will not be there." So it's something that's coming very soon. It's the identical phrase, again, between Hosea 1:4 and Psalm 37 and verse 10, and it implies patience. Now, we might not look at it that way. When we hear a little while, it's okay, God is coming soon. But he's not saying, I am coming right now. There's still, even in that simple phrase, a little while, God is still showing patience, right? We have to remember Revelation, a day to God is like 1,000 years, right? He does not operate on our timeline, you know. So, but he says for a little while it's going to come. It marked the beginning of this kind of swift slide of them having 6 kings in 30 years. You know, and really and that's because of conquering armies and what have you. And really, that goes back to when they rejected God to begin with. Remember when they said, we want a king, and the prophet tried to say, no, you don't. Prophet's talking to God, and he's like, look, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. give him a king. I'm going to give him a king. This is who he's going to be. Turns out to be Saul, some good, some bad, all of that. And had they not rejected God then and kept on that straight path, it probably would have been of great benefit. I'm sure that it would have been for them. So it all started with them winning kings, and then they just got worse and worse as time goes on. They go back to being faithful, and then they go back to being bad. And this marks this decline, and they're going to have 6 kings over the course of 30 years. And so it's the decline of the northern kingdom, prophesied by Amos over in chapter 7 and verse 9 of Amos. He prophesies there. After the 4 decades of Jeroboam's reign, look at my notes here, from 793 to 753 BC. So after 4 decades of Jeroboam's reign, his son Zechariah, he barely had time to warm the throne before he's killed. He's cut down by Shalem. And the site of the assassination there is Ibleam, which is Ibleam, if you're taking notes. And it's significant. It's a town about 13 kilometers south and west of the city of Jezreel. Right? And it's at the southern tip of the valley where Jehu murdered Ahaziah in 2 Kings 9:27 there. So it's a very significant spot. And again, God is saying that this punishment, in a little while, it's coming. And this starts the slide, and the punishment is coming. I want you to name him Jehu. We've got this very significant place, and it's going to happen at the exact same place as it was before. Any thoughts or comments so far, or questions? So the name of the next child, daughter, named Lo. We're just going to go with Lo Ru. Okay, Ruhamah, maybe Lo Ruhamah. Her name signifies that the Lord is removing His mercy and His love from Israel. So He's removing His mercy and His love from Israel. From that time on, the Lord will love and save Judah from her enemies, but not by earthly means. There's a slight idea, and this came up a little bit at lunch yesterday, that God loves everyone. And God does love everyone in the sense that He sent His Son to die, for the whole world, John 3:16 and following. But it is an example that I've used before is you may love all children, right? All children are cute, all children are blessings and all of this. But you don't love all children the way you love your child, right? That makes sense? Your child is special to you. They hold a special place in your heart, and you take certain joys in them. It's kind of the same thing, is that yes, God loves everybody, but there is a special love for the people that are His. And so it's saying that, He's going to love and save Judah from her enemies, Judah, His children. He's removing His mercy and love from Israel. It's kind of like, I still love you, but not in the way that I love my own. And the reason being is in the context of what we're talking about here in Hosea, because you've become an adulteress. You have rejected me. You've gone after other idols, other God. You don't want anything to do with me. So yes, I still love you. And I still hope that you come back. But I'm not going to be there for you. And it's, again, human relationships, the same thing. You have a child that you have reared, and, they become an adult, and they start to reject you and everything that you do, and they don't want anything to do with you, and they go off on their own. They don't talk to you or anything. I still love you. I hope you come back. I hope you get your life where it needs to be. But you've gone off and you're doing this. I can't be there for you. I'm not going to participate in that. You know, a lot of people think, well, I think the big thing now, for example, is children identifying as one gender or another or something, and they want their parents' support in that. And let's say they're older, out of the house. They want their parents' support in that. Now, look, I love you, but I can't participate in that. That's not something that I agree with. That's not something that I promote. It's not something I condone. Kind of the same thing. God says, I still love Israel, but I'm not necessarily going to be there for them. I'm going to be there for Judah. Why? Because Judah wants me there, right? And it's even more terrifying than Jezreel, because the name, it's not ambiguous. It's not, cloudy or anything, and it needs a lot less explanation, because it marks a sharp turn in God's attitude towards his people. Now, Israel means northern kingdom. That's what it is meaning in this context, their very national identity was built on God's compassion, right? His commitment as the stronger of the weaker of the two. He committed himself to his people, okay? And it was demonstrated in his constant parental care for them. See, Psalm 103 and verse 13, just as a father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him. So there's a great father, that was Psalm 103 verse 13. So there's a lot of fatherly love and care and parental care there for them. And the keystone, the cornerstone of that care is based on forgiveness. Let me see here. When we look at this love that God has and his compassion for them. Deuteronomy 13 and verse 17, talking about this cornerstone being forgiveness. Deuteronomy 13:17 says, "Nothing from that which is put under the ban shall cling to your hand, in order that the Lord may turn from his burning anger and show mercy to you, and have compassion on you, and make you increase, just as he has sworn to your fathers. If you will listen to the voice of the Lord your God, keeping all his commandments, which I am commanding you today, and doing what is right in the sight of the Lord your God." So people turning from their wicked ways, following in the commandments of Christ, well, New Testament Christ, Old Testament God, then there is forgiveness there, and that's the cornerstone of his love. And it's the same in the New Testament when we look and we see, why did Christ come? He came because of God's love for us, that we might be forgiven of our sins if we repent of them and turn to God. So the character of God, and I use that term character loosely, the nature of God, it does not change, right? And he says, I'm the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And that's just another point in it. The cornerstone of God's love has always been forgiveness of people repenting for their sins. God's love, in a general sense, is unconditional. In a general sense, again, John 3:16, he loves everybody. But the love that he has for his own is conditional in repentance, in asking for forgiveness, in following in his commandments. There is condition to being loved as one of God's own. And there are so many people in the world today who live whatever life they want. I'm still going to heaven. Yet they've met no condition at all. Any comments? Or do I? Yes, ma'am.
Well, I'm just thinking that overall, relationship is kind of the word that, is the umbrella over all this stuff. We need to realize our place, where our place is. We're
Absolutely.
not the center of things. God is the creator, and we are in submission to his will. And these people, people who do not submit to God's will, do not give God the honor and glory that he is due. The Bible tells us he's a jealous God, and rightfully so, because he deserves, our praise, our worship.
Absolutely.
And until a person realizes that God is over all, and I submit to his will, then there's going to be, it's going to be a big mess.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
And that's what happened to Israel.
Yeah.
Turned, and they're always, it's the same consequence.
Absolutely. For those that for those that are watching this online, because sometimes they can't hear the comments that people made, just kind of boiling it down is the relationship, and that we have to realize we are not the center of things, that God is. He deserves our praise, not to question. And that really is key. Jesus said, a servant's not greater than his master. We're told in the New Testament, what right does the clay have to ask the potter? What are you going to do? In Job, he got so frustrated and he started questioning God, and God got frustrated enough to finally say, where were you when I laid the foundations of the world? Where were you when I stretched out the heavens? Gird up your loins, which if you don't know, that's pull up your pants, and gird up your loins, you're about to answer me like a man, That whole, and that's, just as a side note, that gird up your loins is interesting in and of itself, because they would tell the men to do that before they went into battle. They would pull up their loins and like tie them around their upper thighs. That way they wouldn't trip over their long clothes when they were going into battle. So it's almost as though God's saying, gird up your loins. It's like, we're about to have a fight. Just kind of an interesting little tidbit there. But no, could not agree with you more. We're not the center of things. And you using the word relationship there, that is key. A lot of people don't understand God. But God, as much as he wants us to, can be understood if we look at it as a relationship. And a covenant relationship. Because, you become a Christian, you are under that new covenant. And it's just looking at it as a parental relationship, parent to child. You're the parent. Your child does something wrong. They get punished, right? Sometimes that punishment might just be, you really shouldn't do that, right? And sometimes it might be that. Other times that punishment might be, I need you to go in the backyard, get a switch, and come right in here, right? So, it depends a lot on the severity. And I've used this example. If I were to take a key and scrape a rock on a sidewalk, no one would say anything, right? If I took that same key and I go to a junkyard and I scrape it against a junky car, that's out there just for parts, someone might say something, but they're probably not going to do a whole about it because it's a junky car and it's just sitting there anyways. Now, if I take that same key and I go to a car lot and I sit there and key a brand new car, I'm going to jail. It's not what we do, it's the value of what we do it against. We look at sin on all different types of levels and say this might warrant this punishment with God, this might warrant this. It's the value of who God is, right? But there's that relationship that we have to look at it. God is our Father. He needs to be respected like our Father, loved like our Father. Sometimes we don't understand our fathers, right? Sometimes we might get into an argument with our father. Sometimes we might get into, questioning our father, but ultimately there should be love and respect there because of who they are. So, absolutely. But any additional thoughts or comments or to add to what Sherry was saying? Okay. I keep looking at the clock up there. 8 minutes. So the second son's name, Lo-Ami, or Lo-Ami, we're not sure, means not my people. And it declares to Israel that her relationship as the Lord's people, it's come to an end. Okay? It's no longer will they participate in the covenant that was made at Mount Sinai with Moses, except for the mercy of God. That's the only way that it's going to happen, is if God allows it to happen, right? And it's the same with us, as was mentioned, we're the clay. We don't get to tell God what to do. It's all based on His timeline and what He wants. The New Testament says all things were created by Him and for Him. Right? We tend to think, as Sherry was saying, that we're the center of the universe and that it was all created for us. It wasn't. And so in this second son is that they will no longer participate in the covenant unless it's by the mercy of God, unless He allows them to. Yet despite Israel's sin, that mercy is actually still available, and the possibility of a renewal of that relationship is still there, because He says, again, a little while. So there is the possibility that can be restored, that relationship. And as terrible as the day of Jezreel would be, the people of the two kingdoms, they could be reunited and ruled by one leader, right? We have lost the verse here. Where Jezreel a little. Okay, verse 8. The word weaning is mentioned. Now, presumably, that shows a time period of about 3 years. Okay, some notes on that. 1 Samuel 1, verses 21 through 28. So 1 Samuel 1, verses 21 through 28. Because, and that's a elapsed time period of 3 years between the births, depending, but that's kind of the general time frame. And the time frame, it may serve to show not only the continuity of Hosea's family life, but also to hint at the forbearance of God, who, even though He announced judgment through the first two births, He was demonstrating, again, that long-suffering love. Right? So He says a little while. We've got these two births, and they're named to signify that mercy, protection, and what have you would be removed from Israel, and that it would be with Judah. But then there's this time period of about 3 years that they have. Again, symbolically, I believe that this happened, but we have to look at the symbolism as well. Symbolism saying that there were 3 years that God could have, or that they could have, come back to God and what have you. It almost seems like, because God could have put His judgment and His punishment right then and there if He wanted, but He's never really done that. I mean, you think about it, even Sodom and Gomorrah, had people right there preaching and talking to them. That was people getting mad. How long it took, Noah to build the ark, and he's a preacher of righteousness. God's never not given people a chance. Even the people of Nineveh with Jonah. Jonah didn't want to go there because what they had done. God gets them there anyways. They end up repenting, at least for a while. God's never not given someone an opportunity, right? And then with the naming of the third child, the signs of judgment, they've really reached their climax. Not my people. And that signifies this total change in God's relationship to Israel. The waywardness of the nation it's nulled or annulled the covenant with God. The son's name not only described how Israel had behaved as if they did not even belong to God, but also declares God's response for them separating themselves from Him. All right. Any thoughts or comments? Closing thoughts or comments? Okay. We're going to leave it off there. I know there's only 2 verses, but we don't necessarily have time. So next week, we'll start off in verse 10. We'll finish up chapter 1. We'll read through chapter 2, and hopefully get through at least the first 5 verses of chapter 2. Maybe we'll get through the whole chapter.